Hi everyone, and welcome back to Kinetic Abilities channel and to our first episode in our SurFit series. In this video we're going to be looking at exercise training basics and understanding the theory, looking at movement planes, joint health, what goes into a robust basic fitness program, and a little tip at the end just to kind of tie all that together to make sure that you make as much progress as possible, so make sure you stick around for that. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Any links that I'll be mentioning in the video will be found in the description box down below. Let's jump into it.
So to start, we have the anatomical movement planes. These are just areas in space which describe where movement takes place. First up, we have the sagittal plane. It is a forwards and backwards and up and down plane. So imagine that you're stuck in a narrow corridor. An example would be a forward lunge. Next up, the transverse plane. This is where rotation occurs. An example would be a rotational ball toss. And lastly, the frontal plane. This describes left to right motions as well as up and down. With this plane, imagine that there is a thin sheet of glass either side of your body. An example would be lateral lunge.
So linking the movement planes with joint health and training, the next consideration needs to be what exercises are you doing and what movement planes do they occur in. So our joints can move through a range of all of those movement planes and a combination of those movement planes. So for that very reason, it's very important that we do expose and train our joints to all the different ranges and movement planes for optimal joint health. Let's take the shoulder for an example, which is a ball and socket joint, which allows for a great deal of motion. And what happens when you don't expose your joints to all the different ranges and movement planes, you get reduced ranges of motion, pain, and in the end, you do tend to get quite a bit of injury. For a working example, let's say person A, they train bench press and lat pull down in the gym. So they get really strong anteriorly, okay, and they now cannot lift their hand over their head. So a bench press is an example of a sagittal plane movement, and the lat pull down is an example of a frontal plane movement. So this is where you start to see quite a lot of compensation. So if you cannot lift your arm any higher than this, what tends to happen is the lower back gets overly arched, or the head comes forward, anything to just make it appear like the arm is where you want it to be, really. There is a number of different reasons why you might have restrictions in getting your arms up overhead. For example, reduced thoracic spine extension, lat pec flexibility, you might have pain and injury, reduced scapular control, or in the case of person A, reduced shoulder mobility and strength across ranges. So this is down to a simple training error of not training through the various ranges of motion that the shoulder is capable of and not exposing the joint to the different movement planes. So you're not going to develop strength through range if you only focus on training 20% of the joint. So what we want with all of our joints is the ability to move in and out all of the different movement planes smoothly and with control and strength. And what we don't want is to get locked in a particular movement pattern and then we cannot get out of it. So it's all about keeping that structural balance around the joints, and basically whatever you expose your body to, you will adapt to that. And this brings me on to the components of fitness, which are strength, power, endurance, flexibility, speed, accuracy, coordination, reaction, balance, agility, and cardiovascular fitness or conditioning. So depending on your personal weaknesses and limitations, as well as your training aims, it will basically determine which component or components that you need to work on. We'll be looking at more of that just in a sec. So in a basic, robust fitness program design, you should include basic quality movements, fundamental patterns, such as the squat, hinge, push, pull, and conditioning. So the squat, I think everyone pretty much knows what a squat is. Okay, how low can you go? Can you get your knees over your toes? Can you sit nice and deep? Do you feel like you're gonna fall forwards, backwards? Can you keep your arms up? Next is the hip hinge or the hinge. This is the ability of you to use your hip to generate power without using your lower back. Then for pushing, you've got your press ups or your bench press. And for pulling, you have got your pull up and your horizontal rowing motions. And for conditioning or CV fitness, whichever you prefer to call it, you've got aerobic and anaerobic energy system development. So all of those movement patterns that I've just gone over, they include a combination of all of the movement planes. Depending on which joint you look at, there will be something else going on in one of the joints above and below. When you've got a solid foundation in those basic foundational patterns, you can then add the sport-specific strategy. So if you don't have that foundation yet, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be playing or participating in your sport. What I'm saying is, regards to your training, you should focus your efforts into just developing those basic patterns of push, pull, hinge, squat, CV fitness. Keep it simple. Part of your basic training structure should be around your training aims. So your training aims are going to help to dictate what basically training parameters and variables of those parameters that you are going to utilize in your program. For example, you got your rest, your sets, your reps, your tempo, percent of your 1 rep max that you're going to be working at. Depending how you manipulate those variables is going to give you a very different physiological training stimulus and adaptation. So our training aims ensure that we can achieve what we're setting out to achieve. As long as the training aim matches up with the training variables, we will get what we need as long as it's applied. So there are some other terms I'm not going to go over today, such as periodization, training volume, deloads, training splits. I'm not going to include it in this video, it's for another time. So let's take a working example. Person A is doing 3 times 20 squats at 15% of a 1 rep max with minimal rest between sets. Their training aim is to develop strength. So as you can see, the person's training aim and their training parameters and variables are not matching up. Okay, so their training aim is to develop strength. However, their training structure and parameters are lined up to train endurance and aerobic capacity. So here you can see the graph of the training parameters, the rest, the sets, the reps, and you can see that there is some overlap. It is a continuum, so there will be some crossover if you're training strength and hypertrophy. Also, a point worth mentioning is if you are a trained or an untrained individual, will have a big impact on that initial training stimulus. So if you are untrained, you've never really trained strength conditioning before, you are going to have probably a very big stimulus to the strength training initially. And that brings me on to the performance pyramid. It is a bottoms up approach, so you've got the movement quality on the bottom, you've got your performance components in the middle, and finally your skill and sport-specific skills, on the top. So again, have you got those fundamental movement patterns, squat, hinge, push, pull, aerobic, anaerobic capacity? That is the bottom, okay? Can you do an unweighted squat well? If you can, then the pyramid suggests that you can go on to basically to train strength or power or whatever other performance variable you're trying to achieve. So basically it's saying get good movement patterns first, then load it. It's not a great idea to load restricted joints with a lot of load. So once you've got something like a good squat pattern, you can then level up and move into the performance components where you would say train strength, and then you're obviously going to start adding external weight to the movements, which is going to, like we just discussed, depending on your training aim and manipulating those training variables, is going to give you some different physiological stimuli and adaptations. And lastly, you've got your sport-specific which will be your surfing. And again, I'm not saying if you don't have a good squat, don't play your sport. All I'm saying is from a training point of view, it doesn't make sense to try and hit your 1 rep max squat when you can't even get into a comfortable squat without any weight. And something else we see quite a lot of is people trying to train their sport specific skill in their performance components. So there is a difference between training with the demands of your sport incorporated into your training routine versus trying to replicate surfing in the gym. So for example, training aim is to develop power, and the exercise chosen is squat jumps on a Bosu ball because we surf on an unstable surfboard, so that's going to make it more specific, right? So an unstable surface is going to limit that individual's ability to generate their maximum capacity of force production, power. So basically that is going to limit the ability of that person to reach their peak because they are on an unstable surface, which doesn't allow for that training aim to be achieved. Secondly, let's say that person's doing 3 times 12 reps, standard 3x12 squat jumps on a Bosu ball. However, if they're trying to develop power, if you remember from the parameters graph, they should be working at these values. Again, the training variables are not marrying up with the training aim. So that person's going to get really frustrated after a couple of sessions when they don't notice an increase in their power because they're not actually training their body for power. That would be an appropriate setup training plan if that person was trying to work on their landing on an unstable surface, or if they were trying to increase their balance, not for power. So once you have increased appropriately your power capacity, you can then transfer it when you surf in your skill practice, okay? So you need to separate those two things in your head in order to make progress. So my bonus tip, thanks for those who stick around to the end of the video. So the bonus tip is a concept called progressive overload. So progressive overload is a theory that basically suggests you need to continuously alter one of your training variables in order to keep a consistent stimulus to allow your body to keep growing. If you are a rookie, for example, you can do this thing called linear progression, where you just try and get an extra rep every session. So depending on how trained you are, that will or won't work for you. Another example is to increase the weights incrementally week by week. And lastly, I will say it takes time and consistency plus progressive overload in order to make consistent and real results. Thank you for watching our first episode. If you did enjoy it, we'd really appreciate some support. If you could give this video a thumbs up or a subscribe, that would be really appreciated. In the next episode, I'll be doing a needs analysis of the sport of surfing, so looking at what physical components you will need and how to apply that to your training program. Thank you for watching Kinetic Ability, and see you in the next episode.